Okay, so we are back here at the 50 EFI lower intake manifold for the trucks. The last video I made was the actual cutting of runner number 5. The thing is with runner 5 is it's a complete dogleg, or almost like an S-curve. Like, remember Roller Coaster Tycoon, how you had that option for certain spots of a track if you're trying to go from here to here. That's basically what it does. It's like a sideways turn through that. Well, all turns are sideways, but it's extended. You get what I'm saying. Goes right, then goes left. Anyway, so what had happened, to summarize, is the last video I was talking about this a bit, how I turned to like Charlie Cervedio to see, because instinctively I said, oh, I should probably cut this inside wall back, but the last thing on my mind was to cut the outside wall. And you can see how that's scalloped in now. And the reason that is because instinctively when we think about physics, we think about things like maybe, in this regard to runners, you think of maybe a marble, or you think of a bobsled course or a roller coaster car, where you need that embankment for the inertia to guide that inertia and maintain velocity, right? Because obviously making the turn larger is going to slow it down. So you think, oh, why would I ever slow it down? So the thing is that when he said to add area to here, is I didn't really question it, and I instinctively answered on one of the last videos. I said, oh, it's to have available air, like an intake plenum, which I had the right idea, I guess, because if you're thinking of engine vacuum, again, like 25, 28 inches of mercury versus 1 square inch of mercury under gravity, and I forget like the actual mass of air per volume. Like David Vizard did a thing on, he questioned what you think, how many tons of air do you think is in a gymnasium, and so on. So you can kind of go down that rabbit hole all you want, but still most of the time, especially a DIY porter or someone like me that's still amateur, like I have probably 100 hours now behind the grinder on this stuff, and you wouldn't think to bulge that out, but what's actually happening is by creating area, obviously that's going to slow down, but then it's going to create pressure and help the air better negotiate the turn. And that does kind of make sense when you think about it one way, where if you think of the turn, if you think of a car that has too much understeer, is you need all that room you can get. It's not going to make a sharp turn because it's going to be going in the grass. So that's one analogy to draw. But this is mostly done. You can see most of the final finish. I've done that in other ports as well, but that was what we were up to last time. And like the left bank is mostly done. I did start to cut this inside, but I don't think this needs to bulge. It's really mostly, if you look side by side, how extreme 5 really is. So that was that. Here's another question. What is it from Iron Man? Is it better to be respected or feared? Here's the thing. You're not going to be respected, number one, for doing junkyard stuff, or feared because you're not going to make enough power. But if you want to have an advantage of that budget and enjoy it yourself, like doing science experiments at home, it's kind of in that level of doing this equipment. But here's the thing is, with the E7 stuff, the advantage that Ford has, okay, over GM and Mopar, is Mustangs use truck stuff. Well, not this intake, but E7 heads. Like, here's our stamping. What does that mean? 87 truck engine. And there was 85, 86. Every year there's a revision. It becomes a new number. For 90, it's like F0. And you mostly see that on transmission. Like, AOD changed a lot before AODE, pre-4R7W stuff. All right? So the thing is about doing this whole thing, too, is, like, you might get into 60 hours worth of porting for the whole top end of an engine if you're doing it right. And the thing to realize, to stop and ask, pros or experts that have been doing it for decades, like, what to do, is a lot of them are really helpful. They understand, like, this is junkyard stuff. Some keep their cards close to their chest because they're worried about business. But it takes a lot of dedication to do it as a business because it's such an intense thing. And I feel like it would be really easy to get overwhelmed with parts. That's why your turnaround can be months at a time. And for me, like, I wear a respirator, so I only work like 1 hour at a time when I'm doing it. So if you have any pulmonary things, and other than that, doing the job can be addictive. Like I describe it, it's kind of like power washing. But if you do it wrong, it can be a problem. And there's been way too many, E7 especially, I'll see like, it'll be a Bronco, like, mildly ported or lightly ported E7 equipment, or lightly ported intake, lightly ported heads. That's when I know they don't know what they're talking about, usually, because it's like, you'll see, like, here's a stock intake manifold, exhaust manifold, gasket. And these ports aren't exactly final, but you don't even open these up more on the outside. Now, obviously, that's not all porting is. There's a lot of work in the bowl and tunnels, but it doesn't need to be larger than that. And by comparison, I've seen at least one example where having a smaller port was good for 20 more foot-pounds than, like, on the top end, too, than a larger port. So it's easy to go backwards. Someone could say, oh, it's lightly ported, or I hogged it out to the new header gasket. And you watch the video of the acceleration, it's like, that is not where it should be if those were properly ported. Like, properly ported, and my valve train, like, this is doubling the power, right? For example, these front runners, number 1 and number 5 cylinder, these can increase by 100 CFM, going from mid 100s to, like, near mid 200s. So it's something to think about. And the other fact that you can use this in a future engine. It's not like overhauling an engine, you have to get rid of the intake or the heads unless something's damaged, like warped or cracked, what have you. But totally worthwhile. And Ford is unique because you have Explorers, you have F-150s, and all of that is the same stuff that can go in your Mustang, Thunderbird, Fairmonts even, and so on. Or maybe you're a Canadian guy and you have a Capri or other Fox body. So that is a cool thing, because Dodge only had the Viper, so we can't even really talk about Mopar stuff. Then they had the SRT4. Now their stuff is like so overpriced. Maybe if you're playing with Mopar, maybe you have like 318s or something, or maybe modifying a Dodge Ram from the 90s, something like that. That's a little different. But as far as their modern stuff, it's all Hemi stuff, it's all expensive. So it's not quite the same as this stuff modifying in the 80s, where it's stuff you find in a junkyard and you can put it on your Mustang. So it's something to think about instead of just dropping $1,000 on an intake sometimes. Anyway, so where are we? So that's not what this video is about, but I always like to mention that in the videos. And part of the reason why I started logging this fan stuff and modifying a 5.0 is there's too many damn square bodies and there's too many people that do this stuff wrong. And I'm not coming out as an expert. I try to cite everybody and everything and where I learned it, and then people can go off on their own and learn even more, but I try to keep it very simple and stuff. And as far as the intake today, like, I'm not going to get into like, oh, RAM theory and Helmholtz resonator theory and things that you would use to determine, what the runner length is going to do. But I am a software person. I like plugging in cam specs and CFM and kind of getting an idea. So here's the question today. Well, first I'll say what's going on is this whole engine build, the 5.0, like, this is such a long journey, but I got out of control to where this started as an overhaul. Then I saw a nice Lunati cam. Then I had to change the cam. Then from there, every part became a sequence, because if you're going to do an engine right, whether carbed or EFI, from the start of the throttle body, even the filter to your exhaust tips are important. And a lot of people will say that and know that, like, they understand the concept of a bottleneck, and it's all the meat and potatoes in between where it gets screwed up, right? So this is where this thing comes into play, this thinking. So when this was the NA engine, I went through every possible trick to, like, okay, what percentage will this do? How will this work with the cam? And so on. At one point, I had a blower, which I realized I made a mistake, that it probably isn't going to clear the master cylinder because the econoline is further up. Maybe with a body lift or something crazy, it could work, or a different blower bracket or something. But I ditched that idea, went back to the roots of it, and I had water, methanol, and all this stuff. So all the stuff that I did that were like splitting hairs with how to get the engine to maximum potential with stock castings kind of was on the back burner, right? So in regard to the intake, if you are watching this, hopefully you already know about intake manifolds and theory in general, or that longer runners typically produce better low-end torque. They make more velocity than a short runner that's going to allow more air on top at higher RPM. So the trucks do have these long runner intakes with a big plenum, big dual throttle body. There's a throttle body spacer, which stock is like, I believe it's 56 millimeters times 2, so 112 millimeters, and now we have a dual 61, so 122. Anyway, so at one point, I got what's known as a phenolic spacer, okay? And I'll put it here. It is actually a trick flow, so it's nice and flat, like I've seen some stories about Summit ones. Okay, so there's our spacer. You may have heard of carb spacers, or seen what they do, what they don't do. The problem with comparing both is the carb also has to do more with atomization, okay? Because our fuel is right here. There's the injector port, so it's direct port fuel injection, right? Obviously, even a Sniper it's fuel injection, but the nozzles are still above the intake manifold, right? So this is a little bit different, but we'll start with the main principle. So phenolic resin is like you take a phenol group and then a formaldehyde. So stuck in formaldehyde, it's creepy, right? You know that there's trace amounts of formaldehyde in corn pops, actually, that has a preservative, and I think they discontinued corn pops. I don't think you can get them anymore. But anyway, so what this is, the best way to describe it is as an insulator, like a thermoplastic. So we have our cylinder heads, and even though we have a gasket, especially a metal-based gasket, like I'll show you. So, like, this is still metal-based. You see it has flex to it. These are the best for street engines. You might see, especially, this is just a little side note, is you'll see, like, again, people who don't know anything about porting, especially people that you'll see their description, it's like, oh, it's lightly ported. Like, no, you're just not doing anything. It's not worthwhile. I believe this is the 1240, and then I could be wrong, this might be the 1252, and then there's a 1262 and a 1262R. A lot of times what'll happen, because the 1262 is a rubber racing gasket intended for engine breakdown, is the rubber will just tear apart and it just becomes nasty on the engine. So for street, you still probably want a steel gasket. And again, with E7s, you don't have to open these more than stock. Like, you can clean them up, and then how you do the push rod bulge, or if you're going to do a partial halfway bulge. So there's still convection, right? Like, the intake manifold is still getting heat from the cylinder head. I'm polishing my combustion chambers, and you'll read while I'm like mirror polishing them in the piston tops to try to increase fuel efficiency, like higher brake-specific fuel consumption, and, or excuse me, lower fuel consumption, but per power output. But so that comes into question, like, oh, like they're dissipating less heat. Like, is that making the intake hotter or cooler? But again, without going into that or splitting hairs, irregardless, there's still convection into the intake manifold, and then obviously that'll go into your plenum, and the air in the plenum over time, especially whether you're racing or driving a long time, is going to get into the plenum. So your air coming in, even if you have a cold air intake, what have you, or ram air under the truck, like, it's still hotter potentially than it would be with having one of these that's creating that barrier. So that's all that's doing, right? So firsthand, that's how a phenolic spacer should be thought of on an EFI engine with direct port injection versus, like, again, a carb spacer or so on. For carb spacers, you might see, oh, a 2-inch spacer made this much on top, or like you'll see, like, I don't remember, recently I saw something nuts, like 14 more foot-pounds. Like, now you're talking like 3 and 4% power increases. Like, I don't know what that engine was making, but typical small block, I would say that's the percentage. But again, that has a lot to do with the fueling, whereas this, we're looking at heat property, but now runner length. So here's the thing. I have a throttle body spacer, and I have this 1-inch phenolic spacer, okay? Even though this intake is technically going to be flowing more CFM than the stock, well, it's a performance part, but the stock Edelbrock Performer for the truck is that Performer intake is still 4 inches longer in total runner length than this one, which is pretty crazy to believe. But the plenum itself, the intake almost comes up this tall, and then the plenum itself is longer and taller. So that's the thing, is we're only 1 inch out of 4 inches longer, even though we're making more CFM. So as far as like thinking about, oh, like how will this affect the power curve, is I don't know if it would move it that much. Like, maybe it would be like 10 foot-pounds on bottom, but unfortunately I've seen all different things depending. Read a Mopar thing, and that may have been as much as 3 inches, where it moved his power band like 800 RPM, but he didn't lose the peak, so the peak will just move. Right? So let's say you're making 380 horsepower at 55, it would be like making 380 at 52 or 5,000, which is awesome. You actually want that in that case. Anytime you're taking less time to shift at that same peak power, and you don't want to waste power. So right now my AOD is set to 5,500 RPM, but in reality, inherently, this intake manifold will not really do much after 5,000. So that was always a thought, like, oh, will this really affect the power band or take that much on top? And with a truck, you want everything you can get on the bottom and mid-range anyway. Even though, like, I do have a high stall converter, but that's even better because now it's going to launch even crazier. But anyway, the other things I've read about the throttle body spacer, the difference here being this isn't necessarily increasing your runner length, right? Like, this is directly, because it's in a direct path, a vertical path of your runners. This is just adding volume to the elbow, right? So this is increasing plenum volume. Plenum volume could technically cool the air. So in combination, it's not terrible because you have more air available. But I think the thing with the truck reservoir, and I've only really seen a truck spacer is, I've only seen a test on a stock vehicle. And the reality with any modification, it's about percentages, right? The less power you have, the less you're going to see. The more power you have, the more power you're going to see. Or percentage, or not percent. The percentage is the same, but the power is dependent on that. It's relative to your base. So ideally, I bought the parts. I'd like to run both of them. But the problem is, under the doghouse of a van, is it's pretty close where the plenum comes underneath, and then there's like fireproofing, and then the TV cable bracket obviously gives some height. The thing is, there is a 3/8 inch version of this, which I'd hate to spend like 50 more bucks, because I know this would be a hard thing to resell on eBay or something. Sorry, I had to make this a two-parter. So as I was saying, this would be a hard sell on eBay, and I don't remember what I paid for it, but it's, like I said, it's at least a legit trick flow piece. Like, I did read a review, I think it was with like a Summit one, so maybe a knockoff, and some of them aren't real phenolic resin, so that's something maybe that you would see. But the only real tests that I've seen with these are a lot of imports will use them, especially because they have like really confined spaces, and they have like really odd plenums, and usually they're a much smaller amount, but obviously 1 inch is very significant, or people will stack them. So here's the thing. See, now I was just inside, but also, here's what's funny, is when I went inside, I had to charge the phone. My phone was running out of space. Is, of course, on YouTube, what popped up was someone saying how to port an intake manifold, right? What did they do? They took a gasket, a power drill, etched out the gasket, and then just opened it up, okay? That's not porting. It's gasket matching. Maybe port matching is, okay, you want to get your intake directly aligned to, or the manifold ports to the head ports, or the throttle body to the plenum. Port matching is one thing, but gasket opening and stuff like that is, you'll read different things, but like maybe it would increase some throttle response, but you're not really going to get enough CFM necessarily to where it's worth doing. It wouldn't be worth doing if you're taking something off of your engine. If you're doing an engine build and you want to do that, that's like your prerogative. But the funny thing about this is I can guarantee, looking at these E7s that basically have stock gasket sized, is they're probably flowing that much more CFM than someone, and are going to make more torque too, especially against someone who just hogs a gasket up. So I just wanted to make a note of that. It's just funny that as I was complaining about that. And the thing is, like, I'm not trying to be insulting. Like, everyone starts somewhere. Like, I was at a starting point at one point and was mostly ignorant. But the other reason why I make this particular channel to kind of make a journal of this project is to give others that come in a direct path to that without going through a lot of roundabout stuff and getting into deeper stuff that can be very overwhelming. But I try to give off the branches of like where I got this or that, or how I learned this or that. And again, I'm an amateur porter. Like, I have the only tool I have. Like, I have my anemometer, which I don't use, so I have to go on other flow bench tests and rule of thumb. But the point is to do it properly. But anyway, so the thing is with the spacer is, yeah, I'm trying to remember where I left off here, but the thing is, in the van anyway, the 1-inch could run into a problem. The only thing with that is if I run the throttle body spacer, this can move the TV cable bracket forward. Of course, I don't have the baggie in front of me, but it does move that linkage out by another inch, so that might clear the roof of the doghouse, right? But as far as overall intake tuning, adding 1-inch, like, I don't know, it probably, honest to goodness, wouldn't matter. We're not talking about, like, moving 20 horsepower or gaining 20 foot-pounds or something. It's very small. I would say it's mostly about the heat, especially if I have to go to a 3/8 inch. It's mostly about the heat, and then, even then, I've seen mixed things. But even to add some runner length, if it did pick up low-end or mid-range power, as long as it was above 3,000 or below, it wasn't going to kill the power band too much, to where now I have to put the 5,000, because I might put the 5,000 RPM valve back in the AOD. Well, not back, and it starts as a 45, so that's still a big improvement. So I'm just trying to get an idea. And the thing with that is, where that's located in the tail shaft of an AOD, your governor valve, it wouldn't be that difficult to get to under the truck. Like, I could take the tail shaft section off and change that out. So, but that's, making a decision between 500 RPM, because why spin the engine more than it really needs to, and the transmission going under more strain, the rear end, like everything. So that's the only thing. But I did only see like one comment on this intake in particular, and that was kind of the consensus was, because it's already a long runner, and it's only a certain percentage of that, only 1-inch, it's not something that's like a huge deal. But again, I buy things, I have the idea in mind. Any possible percentage or any possible optimum power band is what I chase, so it's still, I don't want to just say, oh, the hell with that, because I already have it. And it also comes with, these studs are pretty convenient, actually, which obviously in the van, you wouldn't be putting the studs on first, so you'd still have to screw these in second, for how it slides in there. But yeah, so there's like a lot of decisions kind of like before final assembly. Well, you put the whole intake, like the engine and long block in with the intake in the van before. The plenum obviously goes on when the engine's in there, is the point. So this won't even be something that I'll be able to know until afterward. But it is something interesting to note. And it's also, I wouldn't want the max torque to be below the converter, obviously, which maybe if you were skipping over some, like, oh, I'm not quite at like 5 or 10 foot-pounds more than it could be if it were stalling at a lower speed. So that's the only other thing. But the reason why I ended up with that stall converter, like a 3,000 plus, is because I had the supercharger. So because I had the supercharger, I needed a better torque converter that had an anti-ballooning plate. So now I have this crazy torque converter, which I know is going to be basically indestructible. But I still think that stall speed is okay. 3,000 on a 1,500 to 55. So I'm hoping that the truck, when it's locked up, is going to launch close to, peak anyway. So when you step on it, it'll already be at like 400 foot-pounds or close to that, which, I don't know, that's kind of my goal. Like, it's really tough. And that's part of why I kept the 5.0, was like, I really want to keep the van with its stock displacement. Because when I was crank shopping, because it does have a forged crank, and then the rods are forged, but they're technically Explorer rods. So I don't know if the forged crank would eliminate it from Pro Stock, but you could still run the cast one with this power level. It's just, that's what I happened to see and I grabbed. But then with a forged crank, you also need like a tri-metal bearing, because, which I highly doubt it'll happen, but at certain levels of power, the crank can come into contact with the surface, so you have an overlay of babbitt, right? And because the forged is a harder material, it can scratch the bearing. So that babbitt helps protect the bearing overall. And so that's the only other thing. And at that time, I was like, oh, I could have made this a 331 stroker and had even more torque and power. But I don't know. I kind of liked the idea of a smaller engine pushing this really big vehicle. So that's kind of the game of playing with that. But so that was also the thing, like, is it possible with the stock castings and that cam for this to potentially hit like about 400 foot-pounds? So, or does it just become an issue of displacement? So we'll see. I think it'll be close. But the point is, that's how much of a difference a torque converter, a high stall speed, and your rear end gears make. Like, the fact that it's started, like when you step on it anyway, that it's launching and locking up at that torque level, that's pretty sweet. Like, that's definitely going to get up and move. Even if it shuts down at 4,800 or something and has that small window, and that's why tuning the AOD is important. And again, I'm hoping that something like this wouldn't, like, oh, it took away this much horsepower. So we'll see. And again, if this doesn't fit, maybe I'll buy the 3/8, because especially in the dog, it's definitely advantageous to get as much cool air in the plenum as possible, just because the doghouse gets hot. But with the combo of the louvers, something like this, if it makes a big difference in the plenum, I'll definitely take that over not. So anyway, so I'm going to get back to finishing. It's pretty tricky. I'm a person that moves all over the place and doesn't focus, but I'm like, don't move this. Keep it on this side, so we're focused on the top end and the left bank. Like, everything you can get to from up here is done on these 4 runners. And at least, like, trying to get all the carbon off. And I might try to match this up, like maybe put a couple more bolts in this and see if we can take some more material off and then look at the plenum. It couldn't hurt to match this up, and then look at the gaskets too and see how close they are to the actual spacer. Well, the gaskets being more important just in case we can't run either spacer, but could take a little material off, wouldn't hurt, because that could definitely, like, especially there, it's a little restrictive, so we shall see. So now, a scenario like this is when, okay, you'd be gasket matching or port matching, but this in itself, that's not what's considered real porting. So anyway, all right, see you later.